So we're talking about Esther. So yeah, we've been in the book of Esther this is the third week now, and we're going to have Esther in the building today, don't we? We have young Esther and her new sister Rachel, which is lovely, with Troy and Jana. So they came and visited today. So make sure you meet young Rachel, and don't call her Rebecca like I did. So yes, let's focus on what we're going to look at now by beginning in prayer. So thank you, Lord, for your word to us. And Lord, how you're a humble God, Lord. You do things in subtle ways, Lord, to show your great strength, Lord. And it's a paradox to us, but it's true. So, Lord, as we go through this today, I pray that you open our eyes to this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so I've called this message Esther Rises. Now, there's multiple reasons for that. Now, I'm going to hand it over to you. Can anyone suggest one of the reasons I called it Esther Rises? If you just heard the story, there's one obvious one. Obscurity. Yep. So she's rising up in importance. Sorry? In prominence. Yep. There's also something I mentioned in an earlier message about Esther. Okay, well, yeah, so the first one is that, she's mentioned for the first time, so she's rising up, and she's, as you see in the story, she rises up through the ranks, but also that her name means star, or something hidden. And although the reference to being hidden more refers to God being hidden, in this story, God's hidden hand, so he keeps in the background while his hand brings about his purposes. And what is the ultimate purpose behind the events in Esther? So you've got to think about that. So it's not just so that we can understand more of Purim. It's not just an insight into ancient Persia. So what is it? Yes. The Messianic line, because at the end of the Messianic line is obviously the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Yes. He's the true bright and morning star, which was still nearly 500 years away at this point. And the point was, if the Jews had been exterminated at this point, as Haman tried to do later in the story, the nation which God had promised to Abraham that they would produce the Saviour would never have existed at that time, at the time of Jesus, when the plan was. So basically, no Jews, no Jesus. And no Jesus, no salvation, no, fill in the blank. We'll get into more of those things as we go through, the things that we miss out if we don't have Jesus. It doesn't bear thinking about. So that's the incredible significance of the book of Esther. But before we go any further and get into chapter 2, we need to know where we are historically. I've sort of touched on this, but it's always good to keep the historical foundation there, because this is real events. And because there's been a fair bit going on between the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. So, we'll see a bit of that in verse 16, which will be next week, which gives us a time stamp of 4 years later from where we were in chapter 1. But hopefully you'll recall, if you were here for either of the last two messages, that there's something big in King Ahasuerus' plans. As we went through chapter 1, he was aiming towards something. And just mentioning Ahasuerus, Josh corrected me during the week. I'll give it a go. Ready? Ahasuerus, something like that. Yeah, that's the Hebrew way he meant to say his name, but I'll stick to the anglicised version, Ahasuerus. But he had a plan. What was he planning to do? There's a big thing coming up in the near future in chapter 1. I have to repeat it again. Invade, thank you. Phew! He's going to have a big invasion into Greece. That was his plan. So when we read through chapter 1, you can sort of see that, and it helps fill out some details. That part of the reason behind those big parties and the reason why he had to deal so quickly with Vashti when she disobeyed him, because he was trying to pull everyone together in preparation for this war. Now, this war was pretty dear to him, to his heart, especially because his father had tried a similar war about 10 years before, a decade or so before. His father was Darius, but a different Darius. But he was unsuccessful in that battle, so there was like unfinished business in the family. So this was part of the honour of those days. He had to go and finish off the job. So there was family honour at stake, and of course the honour of the Persian Empire as well. So historians tell us that in the years between chapter 1 and 2 of Esther, that's about 483 to 479 BC, Ahasuerus pulled together a massive army, and he went across the Dardanelles, or Hellespont, on the map in Greece, and I'll show you where that is. This one, there we go. So there's Hellespont there. It's actually very, very close to Gallipoli, actually, in Turkey there. Gallipoli's in that same little gap, just slightly further up. That's the Hellespont in Greece. And in fact, the place is fairly wide, but I'll get to that in a second. So what he had to do was build two great floating bridges over the water. So I'll show you a picture of someone's drawn up an example of what a floating bridge might look like. So you've got a whole pile of boats with planks over the top. But you've got to get troops over, so it's got to be, substantial enough for that. So it was about 1.5 kilometre breach there, across the river. Well, across the ford, the break there. Now, there's lots of words. I'm not going to try and pretend I know anything about geography. So the only problem was that he didn't account for the strong currents. Now, even today, they comment on that. There's only certain times you can travel through there because the currents are so strong. And then he also had a storm which destroyed the bridges and left the army stranded. So they ended up getting defeated because of that. So, interesting side note there, as this gives us some insight into Ahasuerus. He's reported by the esteemed historian Herodotus, who wrote about this, that he was so mad at the sea that he commanded it to receive 300 lashes with whips. And that's not all. But 300 lashes, that'll teach it. But no, he also had shackles thrown in, so the idea like to shackle the sea, and then branded it with red hot irons. So that's really going to make a big difference, isn't it? And had soldiers shout and curse at it. All of which would have made how much difference to the situation? 0, yes. Might have made him feel better, I don't know. Anyway. But, so I guess we can consider ourselves, when we get mad like that, what good is our letting out our frustration actually doing sometimes? Now, perhaps we'll just look as silly as Ahasuerus did here. Well, to our mind anyway. Although just to point out, these people believed that there was a sea god, just like there was a storm god and a fertility god and all these kinds of gods. So and these ideas may well link back to these actual fallen entities, angels and demons and things, from back what we call prehistory, which, spoiler alert, there's a bit of a link to that and the alien intrusion idea. So that's partly why I love to get people to see this movie. But as far as Ahasuerus is concerned, we can perhaps see a little bit of the reason why he might have done that. He's trying to actually attack those gods. But really, even he would have known he's just letting off steam, isn't he? That's all he's doing. Expressing his petulance and selfish pride. Because, whipping water is pretty close to a literally insane thing to do, I think. In fact, Herodotus noted that this was, in his words, highly presumptuous way to address the Hellespont. The history shows us it wasn't really unusual behaviour for an egomaniac like Ahasuerus there. So anyway, there's just just give you an idea of the state of mind of Ahasuerus and the background of the situation as we come back to the story of Esther now in chapter 2. Now this is, he was obviously very mad. Think about it. So he just come back from a big failure. He was obviously grumpy and mad and probably embarrassed, because he failed again, like his father failed before him. And he's probably looking for some loving arms to come home to, wouldn't you say? But guess what? He didn't have any. He just dismissed her a few years before. And from what we've read in Esther, you can see he did quite admire the opposite sex. So with that background, let's have a look at what happens next. So starting in chapter 2, verse 1. So after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. So now he goes, oh yeah, I dismissed my wife. What do I do now? Well, I'm sure he could have just taken any woman he wanted to and satisfied his desires, but I suspect there's some political thinking here as well. No self-respecting despotic king can be without his queen. So again, it's his advisors that hatch the plan. Now, I don't know if Ahasuerus is not an ideas man, except when it comes to conquering and war. But he seems he never had many good ideas of his own, at least the impression we get from Esther. Certainly not that genius plan to parade his wife before his drunk buddies. That was about the only plan that really we see in there, and that backfired, certainly. So maybe making decisions when you're drunk isn't a good idea. Maybe just don't get drunk, that would be easier. But anyway, so it falls to his employees to catch up, to come up with something, as usual. Okay, so verse 2. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king." Note it was the young men who had this idea. Anyway, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them. Now, it's fairly obvious for most of us why a eunuch was an appropriate choice as a man in charge of 400 beautiful young women. Just in case you aren't familiar with what a eunuch is, he's been castrated, okay? So he's perfect for the job. So that's the situation for Haggai here. So he had charge of the harem anyway, but now obviously the numbers have exploded. So I'm sure he had a fair bit of work on his hands now. So his job was to prepare them all for their turn with the king, to see which ones would impress him. And that took a long time. So it's 12 months, as we're told in verse 12, which is the next verse beyond our reading today. So they were treated with all kinds of women's pampering stuff. And I know sounds like I'm speaking like a true ignorant Aussie bloke when I say that. But what I do know is from the Hebrew word there that the ESV translates as cosmetics, it's the word for scraping and scouring. So you can imagine what kind of thing that entails. I don't know. I don't think Esther would have needed quite the degree that the others perhaps. I don't know. But anyway, almost sounds a bit about as waxing, doesn't it? I'm sure that went on as well. And don't worry, I've had waxing once, and I'm not going to do it again myself. So anyway, these women have been picked out from all over the huge empire, and they're taken, whether they like it or not, to the capital city of Susa, there in Persia, into the king's harem. And we see the point of all this next. So the young advisors are still speaking, verse 4. And let the young woman who pleases the king to be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. Yes, I'm sure it did please the king. So that sets us up now to be introduced to the two key figures in this story, Mordecai and Esther. So first Mordecai, verses 5 and 6. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. You're getting a bit carried away there. It's just the word for exile, basically, so it's the verbs and nouns as well. But now we need to be clear here that the description in verse 6 applies to Kish, so the one about being carried away, the last guy in the list there, or the first in time, actually, because he's got to going backwards, because he was Mordecai's great-grandfather, okay, so you realise that's how he's working, explaining it there, the writer of Esther. So there are some who try and make the case that Shimei there is the same Shimei as the one who lived back in King David's day, which was 500 years before this. Now that's not impossible, given that the Jews are known to telescope their genealogies, that is to leave some names out for different reasons. And if that's true, then we can make some interesting points about the family line and all that kind of thing, but which is why some do that, make that point. But I think it's highly unlikely that this Shimei is the same as the one around David's time, because, as I said, it seems Kish is described as being part of the exile into Babylon, about a century before Mordecai. So the four generations seem to match up pretty well to that 100 years or so, if you take it at face value. So I don't think there's any reason to make that point. So it seems Mordecai had a pretty prominent role in the palace in himself, which may be why he never returned back to Judah after Cyrus allowed the Jews to return. I mean, he might have come a little bit later, but he was happy. He had a good job, pretty comfortable. Plus, he had a very important other responsibility, which we read about in verse 7. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So there we see Esther's Hebrew name, which is Hadassah. Hadassah is the Hebrew word for myrtle, which is in the left picture there. Sorry, so small, but it's the lovely white flowers, sweet-smelling flowers on a tree there. So the symbolism there is pretty clear and positive, which, it stands for, white stands for cleanness, purity. Flowers are beautiful, and the sweet smell connects with the idea of being pleasing to God. That idea is sort of carried in the New Testament as well. So these are all things that we associate with Esther, isn't it? Sweet-smelling, beautiful. And we're told in this verse that she's attractive, and the other things do come out in the rest of the story, the other points about the idea of being connected to myrtle there. So that's her Hebrew name. And as we said, her Persian name, Esther, which is the one used throughout the story, is typically associated with the star Venus, the brightest and therefore most beautiful star in the sky. So that's the other pic. Well, that's obviously a drawing, but you get the idea. Now, of course, there's some pagan connections there as well, with the goddess Ishtar as well, but that's what you get living in pagan culture. I guess you get named by them, that's what you're going to get. Because even Mordecai is a Persian name derived from a Babylonian god, because his name means belonging to Marduk, the big god in that area. But that doesn't stop God using these two in a very powerful way, a way that honours him at all points. Because even when he remains hidden, God does, which of course I pointed out as another possible meaning of the name Esther, something hidden. So however you slice it, I think God is trying to tell us through some of these names, hey, I've got this, don't worry. So he may be staying behind the scenes, but he's dropping hints left and right, and if you're paying attention, you'll see them. If you do a little bit of study sometimes, that's what it sometimes needs. So, but back to Mordecai and Esther. So he was her first cousin, but obviously quite a bit older, so old enough to be a father figure to her. So he took her in and when she was orphaned and stepped up to the responsibility of parenting her, which of course we all need to do for our children, don't we? When we first find out that we're going to be parents, a little baby there, when we first hold that little baby in our arms, whether we like it or not, that's our call to step up to the plate and do all we can to love and care for this new person that God has entrusted to us. It's a huge responsibility, but it's also a huge privilege, isn't it? Those parents know this. This young life will be more profoundly influenced by mum and dad than anyone else by a large margin, certainly in the early years anyway. So as parents, the challenge is there to make sure that that influence that we have is a good one. In fact, I think the word influence is probably a bit weak. Because let's say we're deliberately and intentionally to train our children. And in fact, we're to shepherd them. That's one of the ideas too, to shepherd them, to be intimately involved in guiding them through the challenges of life. Through it all, you could say. And the best thing we can ever do for them is to teach them to know God. And the clearest way to do that is get them familiar with the Bible, God's Word. Let's make it a priority to spend time praying together, teaching them from the Bible. You don't have to know a lot, just, you've got Google, you're fine. Because the Bible is God's own autobiography. It's the only absolutely reliable way to know the truth about Him. There are other ways to know truth about God, don't get me wrong, but it's the only absolutely reliable way. And it's how we grow to know Him, our Creator. And it's the reason He created us, to know Him personally. That's what Christianity is all about, a personal relationship. So while the book of Esther doesn't specifically say that Mordecai brought up Esther in the scriptures, it doesn't specifically say that, it does seem that they knew their place in history though, so you can imply that obviously he would have taught her everything from their Tanakh, the Old Testament. And they both demonstrated faith in God. Now, because Mordecai loved Esther as his own daughter, can you imagine his worry when she's spotted and taken into King Ahasuerus' harem? We always seem to get the impression that it was like, oh great, she's going to go into the harem, it's all going to be wonderful. But let's think about this. Verse 8. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel in custody of Haggai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. See, the problem for Mordecai was, unless she was the winner in this contest, if you want to call it that. I guess it's a contest. Unless she was a winner, he would rarely see her, and she would probably remain childless, which is the worst thing for women in those times. Because once you're in there, in that harem, there's no getting out, most likely, and you really only got out of the compound itself if the king summoned you. So I suspect Mordecai wasn't thrilled about this particularly. But we all have reactions like this at times, don't we? Things happen that we can't see as good things. So we stress out, he might think things like, what are the odds that Esther will be picked? Pretty close to 0. Well, I guess 1 in 400 to try and be close to accurate, I suppose. But, he might think, I'm never going to see her again. Only, what do we know now as 21st century readers that Mordecai doesn't at this point? We have a bit of advantage of hindsight. We know that the odds are irrelevant, really. It's what God ordains that counts. Okay, so that's all right for Mordecai from our view, but we do need to keep in mind there would have been, 399 other families who were probably worried in the same way, and it didn't turn out for them. So this is not to say that everything always works out how you want it to. I think we've all experienced that in life. We know it doesn't work out how you want it to every time, and it's just as true for those who believe in God as for those who don't. But what we can know is that everything will work out for the best. What's the difference? Everything will work out how you want it to, or everything will work out for the best. They're very different things, sometimes. So I'll quote again, which I have recently, Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Now, a very well-known verse, that one. That doesn't mean that all things will work out how we want them to, but they do always work out for the best. Because we have limited knowledge. We're just humans. We can only see what we can see and hear and experience. But God knows all. He's above all. So the way he works things is, in the end, best for us. And no matter what situation we're in, that is the truth. And he gives the reason there in the next verse, Romans 8:29. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn, Jesus, might be the firstborn among many brothers. So in other words, God has this plan from before time to create a family with his Son Jesus as the firstborn and all believers as his brothers and sisters. So that's the plan. That's the goal for God. But if we're going to be part of that family, we need to become like Jesus. Or at least more like Jesus. He was the perfect human being and uniquely also God. So he will arrange events in life so that we are shaped more and more into that image, the character of Jesus. And sometimes that will hurt. And sometimes we'll get worried, though we needn't get worried, but we do. So God is working his plan through in all the world and also in us individually. And he's hidden very often for us too, isn't he? Like you can say he's hidden in Esther. Very often for us we think, where are you, God? What's going on? Well, at least we see, as they say, only the tangled back of the tapestry. You've heard that kind of illustration? The back of the tapestry is all knots and lines everywhere. It looks like a mess very often. But when it's all said and done and God shows us the front, he turns it around when we get to be with him, all will make sense. So the question for each of us is, do we trust God enough to let him do that without trying to take back control of our own lives? We need to give our lives into his hands. And that takes faith. It takes trust. And it takes belief that what God said is true. So if you haven't come to that point in your life yet, please consider the importance of doing that. It's an eternal decision and one we all have to face. We all have to face God, and we have to have something at that point. And if we don't have Jesus, we're in big trouble. So please come and talk to someone, talk to myself, talk to Evan, whoever you trust, if you need to make that step. And honestly, you won't regret it. But now, as for Mordecai, he's still probably just seeing the back of the tapestry here when Esther gets taken into the harem. But like I explained, it's all for the best. And straight away we see how Esther was just the right person for the job, verse 9. And the young woman pleased him, that's Haggai, and won his favour. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Alright, so she obviously caught Haggai's eye. It probably wasn't just her external looks, but her inner beauty and her resourcefulness or whatever else that would have been the clincher and made her stand out from the rest. Because very often I find that it's the inner beauty, the attractiveness of someone's character that really makes the difference. You know, some people when you first meet them, they're good looking until you get to know them and you find they're a bit conceited or they're dishonest or whatever, and pretty soon they just don't seem so attractive just looking at them. It's strange the way your brain imparts that to people when you can see the truth. Now, I'm sure it's largely that just the association of your mind with the physical appearance, but that's what I've found anyway. And conversely, there are some people who you don't even notice physically at first, but become more beautiful and more intriguing as you see the goodness in their heart. And I'm not talking about inappropriate attraction here, it's just the nature of how things are in life, I think. I think we all can experience that kind of thing. So here Haggai realises this woman has some special qualities which may suit a Persian queen. I guess that's his brief, isn't it, really, to get a Persian queen? So that's the kind of things he's looking for, but obviously good looking is one of them, because that's definitely in the brief. So he accelerates her ascent up the ranks, you could say, and he even gives her her own entourage and puts them into 5-star accommodation, which is a pretty sweet deal, I reckon. It would have been pretty nice. So now she's in the box seat to be queen. Now I'm sure God was having a little whisper in Haggai's ear too, because you've got to keep in mind, remember, what God is actually doing this. So now, not that Haggai would have recognised God's voice as such, but I think we can see that God was working in this, putting his woman for this time at the front of the queue, making the way. Now, is God going to do this with everyone who trusts him? Get them to the front of the queue? No, because some of the Christians are trying to get in the same queue, aren't they? So of course not. But the point is that with hindsight, we can see that this was bringing his plan about. And in the same way, when we are with God in glory, we will be able to see why these things that didn't happen in our favour, as we would understand it on earth, were actually part of God's plan too. So this is where faith is so crucial, and why God seeks to grow all of us in faith, because that's what we need to look beyond our circumstances sometimes. And as I've quoted before, God finds a way every day to ask you the question, do you trust me? Now, with that thought in our minds, how should we understand the next verse? So in verse 10, was Mordecai lacking trust in God? So verse 10, Esther had not made known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. So was that a lack of faith on either Mordecai or Esther's part? Shouldn't she just be open and tell everything and let the chips fall where they may? Well, there's a time for that, but there's also a time to be wise. They say knowledge is power. Well, that can be used in a worldly way for sure, but knowing something someone else doesn't always gives you more options than if you just go and tell them everything straight out. Okay? So you're keeping that close to yourself. So the wisdom is very often seen in the timely release of information. So it's right to assess the situation to the best of your knowledge and keep or release information accordingly. God does the same thing. In the Bible we see him progressively revealing information about himself and his plan over thousands of years. And part of the reason for that is so that the enemy forces, so they're led by Satan, as we know, they can't get too far in their plans to try and thwart God. He is just letting a little bit at a time. So that's what he does. It's called playing your cards close to your chest. I think you've heard that phrase before. So this is wisdom. It's the kind of wisdom that Mordecai shows here. For Ahasuerus to know that Esther was a Jew would most likely put her in a disadvantage in the quest to become queen. That's the human perspective. But also from God's perspective, that information about her identity as a Jew needs to be released at precisely the right time for it to do its work. As we see later in chapter 7. Those who know the story, you think about that, it had to be released at exactly the right time. And those are the kinds of things that God is overseeing. So you will have noticed as I've been speaking through this series so far that the finer details in the story are all so important and interrelated. Okay? All these little, like holding that information till later and all that kind of thing. So there's a few more things I thought I'd just bring up that are important details. So the context in which led to Vashti's deposing, that's an important detail. The state of mind of the king coming back from his failed war. The specific advice from his counsellors, who's had 2 times he's had advice from his counsellors, and they've both worked to make this happen. The fact that Mordecai and Esther are here in Susa and not back in Judah, obviously very important. And now the fact that the truth about Esther's nationality was concealed for the time being. Now, these are all crucial elements to the story, but from the human perspective, they're mostly dependent on the will and action of human beings, aren't they? They would seem like just the things that just happen because people made decisions and so forth. But somehow, they all work together to follow God's plan to the letter. So how does God do that? How does God allow people to make their own free will decisions, but still bring about his plan? Now, this is a huge question. It's a question I remember grappling with over with my Bible college friend Ray Forlin, who actually came and spoke here last year. Remember, fairly tall guy with dark hair. I remember sitting there. We sat in the cafe there at Coorong, and we were talking about this. Now, he's a very intelligent man, but we both had to agree that this one is beyond our comprehension. How can God's free will and man's free will, but God's sovereignty and man's free will, how do that go together? Personally, I've just come to the point where I'm just quite comfortable to say, if someone asks, do men and women have free will? Yes, absolutely. And is God sovereign? Yes. Now, with human logic, these 2 things can't both be true. With human logic. But they both are. Because they're both what the Bible clearly teaches. You might ask where. Okay, well, I think I've found a verse where they're both in it, right? So Proverbs, good old Proverbs, 19 verse 21. They're both there. Watch this. Many are the plans in the mind of a man. Okay, so that's the free will. But it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. God's sovereignty. That's the truth. So whether we understand it or not, we can't because we're human. But God brings it about. So this cartoon here is very often true as well. Well, that is, as long as we don't abandon the path altogether, as some do. They get into one of those holes there in the bottom. Can you make out the people at the front? There's this person in their path in life, kind of. That's the symbolism there. But some people get stuck in one of those holes and don't let God help them out of the hole. And from a human perspective, we can certainly empathise with that, can't we? Getting stuck in a rut. Because if you look at where they are in the middle of the lower graph there, I'll point that out, see that point there, that's actually lower than when he started, halfway along the path. So how can that be a good thing? How can that be part of God's plan, to take us down lower than how we started at some point? Because we plan to have a nice gentle rise up to the top, don't we? Just like that. That's nice and comfy. No bumps. Not too fast that we have to make big adjustments, just minor adjustments, no real downers. And just a nice cushy ride up to glory. That would be good, wouldn't it? But that's never how it works, right? Do you know why? Because God knows that the cushy gentle rise will make you weak and lazy. The only way to get true character is to have a few bumps and sharp curves on the journey, and have times where you're really forced to question and are uncomfortable. Why? Why is that useful? Because you learn to rely on Him more. That's if you're being faithful. If you're not, it will reveal your character for what it truly is and you'll fall away. Now, as I just thought I'd better cover that there, I've talked about this several times. I'm not talking about losing salvation. That's not the falling away. That is, it's losing, you're not losing your place in God's family. Because I would argue from Hebrews 6 that is impossible. I'm talking about falling off into the ditch on the side of the road. For those who were there when I went through the salvation series, you'll understand the image I'm representing there. But a lot of people, they'd fall off the ditch into the side of the road that God's marked out this road for us, and we're off in the ditch sometimes when we get to the low points there. So if you do that, then you'll lose blessing and damage your relationship with God, but you're still his child. If he put his spirit in you in the first place. And if he does that, he doesn't do it lightly. He will bring you home in the end if you're his. But I just thought I'd better address that. That's a bit of a digression. But the point is that God is in control. And that as his children, we will be led through some tough stuff to give us backbone. And that is all God's good plan for each of us. And in the same way, it was God's good plan for Esther to be uncertain in what the outcome of her time was in the palace. She wasn't sure when she first went in. And for Mordecai to feel even more uncertain, probably. He was worried for his beloved adopted daughter. And the final verse in our passage today shows us that. So can you just picture this happening, okay? Ready? Verse 11. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court. I like the NIV actually, back and forwards, because that's what the Hebrew actually says. Like he's always just like pacing. To learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So he's clearly very interested in the goings on in the harem. And maybe the guards got sick of him asking after Esther, and maybe yelling out to her whenever he could catch a glimpse of her, or even talking with her through the fence when the possibility came up. Now, I don't know if I'm even visualizing this correctly, but that's how I picture it. But it's clear that Mordecai was as concerned and intrigued and interested as any father would be. Even though he wasn't her actual father, he was as a father. She was so young, so he was right to have that concern. But as we have read, she was doing very well in there. She was rising up the ranks, if you like, just as God intended. All ultimately for the preservation of his people Israel. And even more importantly, for you and me especially, for the sake of the coming Messiah and the salvation of the world. So this is all preparation. So this came home to me. We were in Perth just recently. I was doing a bit of stuff on our house. We're trying to get it rented, and there's just a few tiles I wanted to put around the sink in the ensuite. But 80% of the job was getting the tiles off and preparing. Putting the tiles on didn't actually take very long. So it's like here, God, there's so much preparation that's required. Most of it is preparation, not in the fulfillment of the end of it. So, God couldn't sit around and wait, just do nothing and wait for the time to come, then send Jesus. He had to keep everything running in the meantime to prepare for that. So that's crucial for us, because that path he's plotted, and our individual paths, like I said, are rough and bumpy roads, and they're good for us in the end. But it's not possible if Jesus never came and died and rose again for us. If he didn't do that path, there's no point of having a path, because we can't get to God. We can't be justified and reconciled with God. We can only become God's children if our sin is dealt with, and Jesus did that for us on the cross. And he can only do that if the Jewish nation survives, because the promise was that Messiah would come through the Jews, which the rising of Esther eventually assured, thanks to God's hidden hand at work. So, to conclude then, we should praise God for his wisdom and his sovereignty in action. His sovereignty is his control over all things. So we can trust him to do his work in his time, in his way, which is very often not our way. But we can trust his promises that he will save us if we call out to him. So let me close now by quoting you probably the best known promise in the Bible. Now, we don't often think of it in those terms as a promise of God, but these are Jesus' own words, echoing God the Father's commitment to us. I think you've probably heard this promise. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him will not perish, but have eternal life. So do you see the promise there? It's in the second half there. If we believe in him, we will not perish in hell. We will live forever. And that implies, obviously, that we will be with him, because he's the source of life anyway. And ultimately in a new heavens and a new earth. So we can stand on that promise. We can put our weight of our whole lives onto those words, because the foundation is Jesus Christ. So we sang Cornerstone. See all these, as we pick the songs, they all fit in there somewhere. He's the cornerstone, he's the foundation. So as we sing this last song now, it's standing on the promises, let's think about that in terms of the promise to save us through faith. So let's sing that.